Welcome, everyone. We are a tiny bit late, but I appreciate everyone so much for staying in the light. Thank you so much for attending this session on restitution and culture called From Display to Dignity, Mobilizing the Diaspora to Lay Our Ancestors to Rest. And to put it mildly, and as mentioned by other panelists today, these are challenging and uncertain times. And I think that's precisely why your attendance at this Reparations conference is so important. I think it signals not just that you care about the matters at hand and what happens in the world around you, but also that you, at least at some level, believe that change is possible. And I do too. And my name is Iben, and I have the privilege of chairing this panel today. I am a Norwegian researcher, and I have been engaged with the African Foundation for Development since about 2021. And in 2024, I joined the African Ancestral Remains Project, which is a collaboration between Afford, Decolonising the Archive, African Museums and Heritage Restitution, and the All-Party Parliamentary Group for African Reparations. And the project was launched against the backdrop of the historical and contemporary events that we're here today to address. And as we know, and as my colleague Onikachi Wambu mentioned earlier, during European colonial expansion and settlement, African and other non-European ancestral remains were looted and brought to Europe as objects of curiosity to be traded, publicly displayed, and used in racist pseudoscientific research, such as the now discredited craniometry, where scholars argue that the shape and size of one's skull could reveal mental and behavioral characteristics at both individual and group level. And today, many of such remains are still stored and used in educational and cultural institutions across the UK, including the University of Cambridge, British Museum, and the Natural History Museum. And in 2024, last year, MP for Clapham and Brixton Hill, Belrabera Addy, raised the issue in the House of Commons that there are several known instances where human remains have been sold and bought, including via auction houses and social media sites. And the Human Tissue Act of 2004, the UK Human Tissue Act of 2004, that is, governs activities relating to human tissue. However, there appears to be a silence in this piece of legislation that allows for the sale of human bodies and body parts for purposes other than transplantation. Much of the trade in human remains is, in other words, legal. And as Dr. Hicks will talk about later as well, there are what could perhaps be referred to as loopholes or exceptions in the Human Tissue Act that excludes quite a significant number of ancestral remains in museums, for instance. And the African Ancestral Remains Project demands action on 3 points in particular. Firstly, to ban the sale of human remains, as these are not commercial objects, but human beings. To end the non-consensual uses of human remains, particularly that of public display. And lastly, for the UK government and museums to facilitate the return of ancestral remains to their communities and countries of origin, wherever possible. And I'm joined today by speakers who are here to discuss gaps in current legislation and policy, as well as best practice and how the African diaspora can be mobilized to push for institutional change in this area. And we have around 75 minutes, I hope, still. And the first 20-ish minutes were supposed to be dedicated to 7-minute statements by 3 African Ancestral Remains Project participants. However, because we're a bit delayed, I was thinking to start with the online participants. So what I will do with the panelists who didn't participate in the African Ancestral Remains Project, I will introduce them ask them a question, and then they can provide their statement. And for Dr. Hicks here, Connie Bell, as well as Dr. Rudo Sithole, who's joining us online, they'll have 7-minute statements. So a slight change in the schedule there. And this is followed by what I hope will be 20 minutes of Q&A, where we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. And just a couple of quick notes before I open the floor to our speakers, and I will stop talking. Many of us will use the term ancestral remains to refer to what is oftentimes termed human remains. And this is to highlight the socio-political, cultural, and spiritual connections that exist between deceased persons and their descendant communities. To highlight that African remains in UK institutions are neither specimens nor tissue, but displaced ancestors. As has been mentioned already today, language really matters. With that being said, I do ask for understanding that some of the language used in our discussion today will, for clarity, reflect that of legislation or official guidelines and policy, and this means that terms such as human remains, human tissue, and human body parts can be used when appropriate, and especially in reference to legislation, for instance. And then almost finally, we're talking about ancestors, descendants, and colonial violence today. And I encourage everyone to be respectful and mindful of that. And also, please take good care while listening and engaging. Ask questions, and of course, feel free to challenge the information you hear from the panelists. But also keep in mind that the topic of reparations, restitution, repatriation, and museums is extensive. We could be here for days. So we have 75 minutes, as mentioned, and I ask everyone to kindly stay on the topic of ancestral remains, their retention, use, and return. Thank you, Nakashi. And then, honestly, finally, I want to give some information on how everyone can get involved in the advocacy effort, which is why we are here today. You can either sign up with your name and email address on paper forms that I hope are distributed around the room. If not, we will make sure that everyone leaves with a form later. Alternatively, there should also be a QR code. If it's not around the room somewhere, then I will make sure to identify it and point it out. It's on the form. It's on the form. Excellent. Thank you, Anakachi. Yeah, I'll mention it toward the end. Thank you. And there's also a broad range of advocacy activities that you can join, including, but not limited to, protests at the British Museum and other similar institutions. You can write letters to your local MP and to the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to demand a ban on the sale of human remains, as well as the non-consensual uses of human remains, particularly that of public display. You can volunteer with the Ford's advocacy team, and there are also workshops you can participate in where you will receive training on advocacy and policymaking. And when you sign up, you will be contacted by the Ford team, which will liaise with you on your preferred course of action moving forward. And it can start big, it can start small. For instance, I started as a volunteer intern back in the day, where I worked on Ford's online archives, and I was later taken on as a policy and research consultant and had the privilege of participating and contributing to the policy report that we launched in March this year. And as we kind of say in Norway, if you do allow me to grossly paraphrase, each push truly moves the carriage. And now, let's start with Dr. Rudo Sithole, who's our first speaker this afternoon. Let's see. Oh, Dr. We got Rudo. Mhishi.
It's Leon.
Brilliant. Let's start with Dr. Rudo. So our first speaker this afternoon co-produced one of the African Ancestral Remains project reports called Dignified Reparatory Repatriation and Rest, which interrogates the ancestral remains policy area from an African continental perspective. Dr. Rudo Sithole joins us online from Zimbabwe. She's the CEO of African Museums and Heritage Restitution and a current member of the African Union's Experts Working Group on Restitution. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Rudo Sithole. Can you hear us okay, Rudo? The floor is yours.
She's on mute.
Oh, you're unfortunately muted, Dr. Sithole.
Yes, I'm okay now.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Iben, for that beautiful introduction to the panel as well as to myself. I'm very grateful to be here today. I'm grateful to the AAPG, Abel and her team, Onyekachi, all those who have put this together for this great conference. And I'm also happy to be reconnected with colleagues, Dan Hicks and Connie Bell. So I'll just, since our time is limited, I'll just go straight to my brief talk, which has the background which has been outlined by Iben about the research we did, and AfriMiere focused on Zimbabwe and Namibia, while AFOD, DTA, and others focused on the UK. So from that research, we are saying that time is overdue for justice to be served to our ancestors who paid the ultimate price as they resisted colonialism. People were killed as they resisted being made slaves, being moved from their lands being taken, their cattle being taken. There was stiff resistance to the point where people were killed. And we are talking about those as our ancestors. But we know that now colonialism and enslavement are recognized as crimes against humanity. So it is time for the UK and other Western countries to collaborate with source communities for the repatriation of the remains of our ancestors. From our research, I concluded that it really boggles the mind that not even a single Zimbabwean first Chumrenga hero has been acknowledged as being in any of the UK museums and collections, despite the well-known facts that Mbuyane was killed, many others were killed, and their remains, especially their skulls, were taken to the UK. There were heads then which were taken to the UK for the now, infamous racial studies. So we wonder really how it can be impossible to identify where such important remains for such important heroes are held. So we are saying that collaborative partnerships should be established between the UK and its former colonies, such as Zimbabwe and Kenya, such that provenance research to identify our ancestors, such as Mbuyane from Zimbabwe, Sekuru Kagubi from Zimbabwe, and it's not only Zimbabwe, there are other countries, for example, Kenya, there is Koitalel Samoei from Kenya, whose history is very well documented of how he was killed, which British soldier killed him, and how the remains were taken to the UK. So along the lines of the Franco-German Provenance Fund, Germany and France together established a provenance fund which can be accessed by source countries to come and work in their countries and identify their heritage, the looted heritage, identify their ancestors collaboratively with the Germans and the French. So we are saying, why doesn't the UK establish a similar fund? for provenance research, so that it can also be utilized for joint research, for example, between people from Zimbabwe and people from the UK, researchers, scientists, communities come together and do extensive research to identify where the ancestors are. The descendants are crying for their ancestors to be returned. During our research, we interviewed descendants from Zimbabwe, from Namibia. We had at least one descendant from each country crying during the interview that, we are desperate for our ancestors. We want them returned so that we can give them a dignified burial. They want closure also and healing. They need repair. So as long as the ancestors are not there, these processes will not begin. So the UK and other Western countries must also stop the sale and display of African ancestors while the descendants are desperate to have them back. It's taboo and the highest form of disrespect to sell or display the body parts of dead people. For Africans, it's unheard of. When we tell the descendants that ancestors are being displayed, they are being sold, they cannot understand how that is possible. So it is time for the continent and the diaspora to unite for repatriation as per the African Union's Common African Position on Restitution, which says that African heritage must be returned to source countries unconditionally, the looted African heritage. As we did with the DTA and AFOD, that's a starting point, but we can widen the collaborations with more people from more countries and more Western countries so that we can have a critical mass for the repatriation of our ancestors. So, in conclusion, AfriMiere will continue to raise awareness and mobilize Africans for the repatriations through various ways, including webinars, conferences, community engagements, and even petitions for the UK to release African ancestors. African countries also need restitution policies. Our research revealed that, and AfriMiere will facilitate that. So AfriMiere is therefore calling for both technical and funding partners to move forward the agenda of repatriating African ancestors and to repay the damage that was done through a comprehensive reparatory justice process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sithole. And our next speaker this afternoon is Dr. Lennon Mhishi, who is an anthropologist and assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. And as a project researcher at the University of Oxford, he's also worked on the project Reconnecting Objects, Epistemic Plurality, and Transformative Practices in and Beyond Museums. Before I ask the question, everyone, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Lennon Mhishi. So Dr. Mhishi, since you bring both an inside and outside perspective, having both in-depth knowledge on the struggle to return the Chimurenga heroes to Zimbabwe, whilst also having worked with institutions such as Pitt Rivers, I wanted to get your take on how we as advocates and practitioners can respond to the pushback against institutional change in this area. And just to bring an example, a criticism of the African Ancestral Remains Project recommendations for a reform of the consent provisions of the Human Tissue Act was that the reform would have so-called far-reaching consequences. Presumably, and I'm guessing, because all human remains, including, for instance, Egyptian mummified persons, would then fall within the remit of the Human Tissue Act. So consent would matter for everyone, essentially. And another common argument, Dr. Mhishi, is against repatriation, is that remains are vital for scientific research and for educational purposes. So my question to you then is, how do you think we should respond to arguments against the return of ancestors and against the non-consensual uses of ancestral remains? I believe you're muted, Dr. Mhishi.
Yeah, I was just waiting to be unmuted by the organizers.
All right.
But thank you so much for your question, Iben. I think, and thank you to Dr. Rudo for sharing a brief thoughts from the Zimbabwean perspective. I think in the first instance, there has to be an appreciation of the mutability of some of these regulatory and legal frameworks that are presented as if they are natural and cannot be changed. I think there's a sense that if cultural institutions present themselves as being in tandem with these regulatory frameworks, then they don't have an obligation to meaningfully respond to the demands for restitution and repatriation, but also in general a demand for transformative practice. So I think challenging the idea that there is a faithfulness to legality is an important entry point. And of course, these laws can and should be changed to fit not just the times, but also fit the claims that are made to particular kinds of morality. I think it's fascinating to consider that spaces and institutions that claim a universal moral universe around rights and dignity in the same breath are not willing to extend those particular notions of rights and dignity to the ancestors of people that they hold, but also to the communities that are in existence in the present. I see the conversation around restitution and repatriation of remains as being part of the broader demand, the shifts in our museums and other cultural institutions function, which is to say, essentially, if these institutions have historically been built on particular kinds of colonial violence and extraction, they cannot work into the future on the basis of those forms of violence and extraction. And remains are one aspect of the violent and colonial enduring present, which is not just in the past, but which we have to contend with today. I also think, of course, that something that might look or sound very simplistic is whether we imagine that we would be willing to have ourselves and our own immediate families who are in the future ancestors to be displayed for entertainment and leisure and to be claimed as objects of scientific study and exploration without their express consent or ours. If we recognize the absurdity of the absence of this ability to show consent, then we obviously shouldn't be using human remains and people's ancestors for the claims of science and education. And in any case, we do not have to rob graves and execute people for the purposes of science. So I think there's a very different future for cultural institutions and for museums that is not built on the foundations of those kinds of violence. And of course, if these institutions are going to exist in these very different futures, then they have to confront the possibilities that their versions of faithfulness to legality and the moral universe have become obsolete. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mhishi. Oh, that's brilliant. And I just want to continue with our speakers just so that we have enough time for the questions because we are a bit delayed. Let's do some of the panelists who are here in person. The next speaker is Dr. Dan Hicks, who is Professor of Contemporary Archaeology in the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford, and Curator of World Archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum. But in the prologue to what I believe is his latest book, Every Monument Will Fall, he opens with what I think is a very timely question. He writes, "Ever felt you've been lied to, not by a politician or a salesman or an ex, but by a museum or by a statue?" Please welcome Dr. Dan Hicks.
Okay, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks for those amazing talks we've had so far. Rudo and Lennon, absolutely great. Looking forward to hearing from the further ideas. Connie. So I want to start big and then get sort of practical. I mean, we were encouraged, Johnny Catchy, to see this as an action-oriented sort of afternoon. So I want to get on to these issues over where we are with the guidelines for the treatment of human remains, which have not been updated now for 20 years. But I want to start with that important observation that was running through a lot of what we heard in the morning, which is how we link reparations with restitution. So I guess the first point is we need to be aware that colonialism is not over. I mean, we only have to open a newspaper to see that fact. And so this isn't about the post-colonial. This isn't about the reception of a colonial past, which is over in the present. So we need to make sense of it. This is about enduring realities. And our museums are among the spaces and infrastructures that are how that imperial past has been made to last and endure. So we need to really understand our museums not as a distraction from the real work of anti-racism and the debates over reparations, but as integrally bound up in the history of, because, well, in terms of thinking about imperialism, colonialism, we're finding a new set of language. We're having to, because we're seeing how empire lasts in a whole load of different ways. We heard this morning about exploitation and extraction. There's also the carceral dimensions of the capitalist colonial sort of project. And it may be in the history of carceral capitalism that the museum was not an anomaly, but actually a part of an enduring sequence from enslavement of living human bodies until the middle of the 19th century, and then the incarceration of the dead in our museums for 100 years or so until the middle of the 20th century, and then the move then into mass incarceration after the Second World War. So from the plantation to the museum to the prison, we're in some ways seeing an evolution of ongoing forms of carcerality that mean that these unfinished debts, in terms of the countless numbers of ancestors who are in our museums, here in London. How near are we right this moment from an African ancestor, an indigenous ancestor? Well, the Wellcome Trust is just next door, so maybe that's the nearest. The British Museum is obviously not so far. But there are countless other museums, regional museums, local authority museums, university museums, the larger museums in the cities and the towns across the UK. If you multiply that across Europe and North America, we're talking unknown hundreds of thousands. We're maybe talking about more than 1 million, almost certainly talking about more than 1 million people, whose fate has been to live out their afterlife in a cardboard box, often not on display, sometimes on display, but the vast majority of these instances we're talking about is about the warehousing of the dead who were dug up from graveyards, whose bodies were taken from the battlefield, and found their way into the museums at a period of time. That the point was anonymization of these people. It was the dehumanization of these people and their bodies, which are abused for eternity, we are encouraged to think, or maybe not. So what do we do about it? How do we see accountability and justice in this important part of the reparations and the restitution conversations? Well, the DCMS guidance hasn't been looked at for a generation, and importantly, the work of the all-party parliamentary group, as sort of set out in this document, which we can sort of hand around, I think, in a minute, or they're up here. Make sure you take one away if you're interested. That involves a series of demands, as we've already heard. So that move in order to ban the sale of human remains when that has been possible for the sale of ivory, but has not happened for human remains, is obviously the necessary but insufficient first step. We need fundamentally transparency and research in terms of what's in the collection. So we've already heard about from Rudo about that idea that important observation that other European nations have invested in the provenance research in terms of what is in the museums. But in terms of human remains, actually less so. The work has been done in terms of understanding how important returning artworks is, but for human remains that hasn't happened. Returning where that's possible, but a larger conversation about what happens when return isn't going to be possible, because the violence was such that the identities and sort of provenance was actually what was actively destroyed. We also, as we've heard earlier, need a new conversation about whether, ever it should be right for human remains to be in our museums in cases on display. So all of that means that it is overdue now under this Labour government, the same as last time we had a new Labour government. These guidelines were looked at and were revised. Now is the time to have another look at them and to revise how this works in our museums. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hicks. And our next speaker is Connie Bell, who is a curator, heritage arts practitioner, playwright, community organizer, as well as the co-founder and director of Decolonising, the archive, which is one of the collaboration partners for the African Ancestral Remains Project, as well as a Pan-African living archive that facilitates heritage-based therapeutic interventions for people of African heritage. Everyone, please welcome Connie Bell.
I was about to say good morning, but we're now in the afternoon. Thank you very much, Iben, Thank you very much, Mr. Hicks. Thank you, Rudo. I can't see you anymore. And Dan, also thank you, also, all the way from Canada, Lennon. So, all right, I'm going to dive into it from an aspect that is the local part of this conversation. And by local, I mean us here in the room, the people, the direct communities that you're involved with. Why? Because we're dealing with an issue of displacement, a displacement of remains, but also a displacement of culture. So what we're looking at really is not just the idea of just the body parts, the human remains, what we are now going to honor and say ancestral remains, but we're also looking at who are the stories behind those ancestral remains. What were their cultures? And how are those cultures now taken away from the narratives of our story? Yeah? How we became. And so the idea is that if the museums are not providing that pathway to that knowledge, then we as the local community need to discover a way to do so. We understand and we recognize all of the things that everyone has said today in regards to the provenance issue and the money issue. But we also recognize that while the museums toil, yeah, and take 20 years, 50 years to toil, many of us die during that time frame. And then a new lot is born to start again from scratch. So therefore, we need to improve upon our methodology where we're not always starting from scratch, right? So we already recognize that many of these museums have many of our ancestors, yeah, some of which really do need to have their freedom to a rightful burial. Outside of that, we recognize that to get that burial is going to be a task and a half. So the decision then amongst us as the community is to decide on how do we assemble together to create a way where we can give those that are being dishonored in those spaces a right, a humanitarian right. The idea also is to bring to a broader knowledge in terms of our socialization as a group of people, the idea of humanity, because these museums have forgotten what that is. The very idea that we are having here to discuss this conversation at this time in life, in the 2025 year of our century of Earth, means that we really have not grown or evolved as a human people. So therefore, we're not going to wait on the museums. What we're going to do is we're going to join in an initiative. But how does that happen? Many times we talk about these things, but we don't really unpack what it looks like. So I'm here today to share with you ideas around how it can look. First of all, we need to mobilize. But the mobilization is never easy because, of course, everyone is coming from different pathways, different roots, different genders, whatever it is. And we tend to find a divide between all of that. So what is the commonality in all of this? We all need to be interested in bringing back the humanity into our societies and the humanity in our practices. Museums were set up to design a way of acculturating a community and acculturating a people. I say today, honestly, and I know they say you shouldn't whitewash everything and generalize, but I think they failed. Because in that remark, as Mr. Hicks mentioned, statues, when we go and we look at this, are we getting the full stories? No, we're not. And we're being told within our school systems that the education and the broadening of that education and history is possibly going to be disallowed. So then, therefore, then, how are we then as community members going to educate our own? We have groups like Esther Jose that have created a People's Assembly. And then Afford and the APPG have also now started a reasoning and a reckoning and approach where we can now create possibilities through teaching, alternative, supplementary approaches to learning. We have created a course program, Decolonising the Archive, joined in with Afford, and of course with Iben's lovely research with some of our graduates. We were able to distinguish how do we then approach the local people in understanding the issues around the museum and restitution. Because many times these conversations not only extend an isolated approach, but the vernacular does not invite us in. So how do we then create a language that invites everyone in so that they can understand? So the course is Museum Restitution, and after you graduate from the course, you are then able to become an ancestral remains ethical enabler. Therefore, you're able to go into museums, tackle them on their own language space, tackle them from a platform where they will accept the language, because many times we're excluded is because we don't have access to that language. So we tackle it from that angle, but we also tackle it from the idea of policy. We then move on further to engage with the history that has been lost, which is the most, I would say, the most important part, and the part that we need to prioritize. That history that's been lost, that culture that has been lost. Because needless to say, that is what is making us perform in the way that we are with the violence that we see being enacted in society today. So what I'm encouraging you to do, rather than going through the various episodes of what is in the archives, yeah, because what we are also establishing also is that they have created this anonymity around these archives. You cannot access them, I can promise you that. On even, you'd have to be doing some super PhD to go in there. And let's be honest, that is a privilege that many of us might not be able to have. So what happens to the rest of us as a society if we don't get a PhD? Yeah? And sometimes that academic thing isn't too good anyway. But the point is, how do we navigate around that as a local group of people? So I'm inviting you now, when you ask us questions, let's explore that together. Let's initiate a progress, yeah, stance, an advocacy stance that starts here today and continues. It doesn't end. It starts and it continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie. I just need to double check. Are there two more panelists?
They're gone.
No one is online. Okay. Okay, brilliant. So, is Graham Campbell, are you still here with us? If so, you are muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you so much, Graham, for taking the time to be with us today online. Graham Campbell is a political campaigner and community activist. And in 2017, he was elected as Glasgow's first African Caribbean councillor. He was also instrumental in Glasgow City Council holding its first ever official Black History Month event, hosted by the Lord Provost in October 2017. So everyone give a hand for Graham Campbell.
Do forgive me, colleagues, that I'm actually in a bit of a noisy place. I'm not here in person because I'm at the Springburn Community Festival in North Glasgow, which is my local area, and I had to come to this. So I'm running an anti-racism group, and I'm running some musicians off the stage. So apologies if you get some wild music in the background. Basically, I wanted to... Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So I wanted to just basically touch base with the record of Scottish museums. The returning of ancestral remains is not a new thing for Scottish museums. And I can speak about this because Glasgow City Council owns a number of museums and galleries and art treasures and has been giving back ancestral remains since 1990, was the first recorded instance of it. Skulls and fragments from Queensland, Tasmanian human remains were asked for by the Tasmanian Aboriginal representatives from the, which both Glasgow and the University of Edinburgh had remains. They were returned. The National Museum of Australia, strangely, asked the University of Edinburgh to return more. We then had the Benin bronzes, which the late great Bernie Grant, of course, asked for us to return the Benin bronzes. Via the Obo and Benin. And that time, in 1996, it was actually turned down. But I'm very glad to say that in recent times, both Aberdeen University, Aberdeen City, and Glasgow museums have returned stuff to Nigeria. Now, of course, remains are a topic of deep upset and hurt for Africans and indeed other indigenous peoples whose bodies have been stolen over these years of colonialism and slavery. We, of course, have a record which is abhorrent. You know, this record that Scotland has in the perpetrating of colonial imperialism and empire is also partly ideological. The idea of the separation of the body from the artefacts, you know, the anthropology of, you know, the sociology of the anthropology of things, and the anatomism and the racist sciences of, you know, people trying to make exhibits of our artifacts and our bodies separate. It's obviously quite true in a lot of African cultures and traditions, and indeed others, but you don't separate the use of the artifacts that a person dies with from their bodily remains. So when the Lakota people asked for the ghost dance shirt back, you know, that was given to them by, you know, a Lakota warrior who came with Wild Bill, what's his face, you know, that one, Bill Cody, to Glasgow in the 1890s. And he basically sold it because he was economically depressed. And that poor man was forced to part with a really important part of his heritage. And the Glasgow gave it back in 1996. But we did so through co-production. And I think one of the previous contributors talked about the processes, about how we do it. Obviously, it's got to be in collaboration with an equality of partnership, as far as we can manage that, between museums, galleries, and cities like ours that possess these artifacts, and indeed these bodily remains. I think it's, you know, it's very symptomatic of the nature of European civilization that they should be so barbaric as to separate the importance of the bodily remains from the artifacts, the culturally appropriate artifacts that come with that body. So the Lakota people got their ghost dance shirt back. And you know what they did? They gave Glasgow a replacement. And that replacement is the symbol of the unity and the link between the Lakota and the Glasgow people. And we tell that story, that of how it was taken away and how it was restored, restituted to the Lakota people. So we need to do that for all of the African ancestral remains. And there are other examples. The Maori people, you know, the Te Papa Tongarewa Museum of New Zealand asked for 9 toy mokos. These are full skulls and heads that were returned. About 15 of them were returned as far back as 2008. So we've been returning bodily remains for a long time and working with those communities from abroad to explain what that restitution means to them. Now, clearly we've got a lot of work to do. The collections are vast, and this discussion about reparatory justice takes place in the context of a revival of empire and the ideology around empire and the racism that comes with it. In Scotland, thankfully, the discussion is a bit more advanced because we've had formal recognition and acknowledgement of the need for slavery and colonialism to be recognised as part of Scotland's story of perpetrating to the other societies that we're talking about here. You know, we recognise that. However, the recognition is slow in terms of the actions, and that's the thing. We have to make the actions more apparent, more active, and we can only do that with the community itself mobilised behind reparatory justice efforts. We have a reparatory justice master's course, which is now in its 3rd year, which I took a good part in trying to create and bring about. We're now in our 3rd cohort of students doing that course. And we learn about the reparations movement itself, about the history of the linkage between Scotland and the Caribbean and Africa, and we learn about the politics of it in terms of getting the British and Scottish authorities to own up to their crime and to make reparation, to make good, make restitution. So bodily parts and the whole, you know, returning it to the context that our ancestors meant it to be venerated by us as their descendants. That is the path that we are now treading, and we need to just tread it a lot faster. we're very proud to be part of the UK reparations movement, because that is, where the right place to have these discussions and to learn from each other about what we can do to make this happen a lot faster. So that's all I'm going to say just now, and I thank the colleagues for giving me the opportunity to have this contribution today. Regards.
Thank you very much. And let us also see if Ms. Elsie Owusu is joining us online. If not, then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience.
Hello?
Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next speaker and final speaker before Q&A is Elsie Owusu OBE, who is an architect, urban designer, and artist. She is also the director of Just Ghana, which promotes inward investment to Ghana, and she was the founding chair of the Society of Black Architects. It's a pleasure to have you here, Elsie. Thank you so much for joining us. And I wanted to ask you a question around your experience in the heritage restitution space. So I read about the reborn concept of a gallery for returning treasures in Kumasi, Ghana. And it would be really interesting if you could talk to the audience about your experience working on this project of a gallery of returning treasures, but equally important, how we as advocates, as practitioners in the ancestral remains space can learn from some of the experiences in cultural restitution.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all. The first thing to say is that the Gallery for Returning Treasures was a project that I worked on with Bernie Grant, and I think that was, the competition was held in 1992. So that's a very, very old project, and it's had various iterations, ranging from the Kumasi version, the Accra version, and I suppose nowadays I would probably not think so much in terms of creating a special institution, because I know that there are lots of people working on various aspects of return. I suppose my concern at the moment is really with the buildings that do exist that are slowly disappearing. My main concern at the moment is with James Fort in Accra. So James Fort was one of the earliest so-called factories, and it started off as a trading post and ended up as a prison in various forms. It was actually the last incarnation was as a remand prison, and it was decommissioned some 10 to 15 years ago. It was the prison where Kwame Nkrumah was, and the founding fathers were held by the British before being released to great jubilation in Jamestown. The interesting thing about it is, well, there are many interesting things about it, but I suppose my real interest is in the ghosts of the enslaved people that remain captured in the archaeology, in the stones of James Fort. And the research that we've done shows that James Fort is built out of Portland stone. So when we first started noticing that there was Portland stone in the building, it seemed very strange because, well, we all know where Portland stone comes from. It comes from the UK. It comes from Portland, and it's absolutely ubiquitous. Anybody walking around London would be surrounded by Portland stone. So it seemed odd to see Portland stone on the west coast of Africa. And what we discovered was that the Portland stone was being used as ballast in the ships going out to the west coast of Africa. And then the stone would be used in construction of the castles, of the forts, and then the ballast would be replaced by human beings on the outward journey to the Americas. So some, and you know, this speaks to what has been called the banality of evil, that some clever clerk in offices in the UK was calculating very carefully how much stone would be needed on the outward journey and how many human bodies, how many human Africans would be used to replace that stone on the way out. And to me, that calculus is very, very, very important. And it's very important that we don't lose that building, and it's very important that we understand who those people are, because many of them would have been lost on the outward journey. There are stories of mostly young people, actually, children, who were kidnapped on the west coast. In particularly a story of Ajumako in Ghana, where young children who were playing in the fields were kidnapped and marched to the coast and put onto boats and brought to the Americas and finally to the UK. And to me, those bodies, those stories are important to capture, to understand, and the buildings which held those bodies mustn't be allowed to disintegrate, and they are disintegrating. I mean, I feel, I don't know if Dan could say something about this, but I feel very sad about it because I think when I started working with Bernie all those years ago, we thought it would be relatively simple to encourage historians and the UK and worldwide to be interested in rescuing the buildings and preserving the buildings, but sadly it hasn't been. So it's not a good story that I have to tell, but I hope that just in mentioning it, that we can somehow, after all these years, after the Africa Reparations movement, and Bernie's enthusiasm and his sad death, somehow bring it back to life again, and that the rescue of James Fort will be a beginning of that process.
Thank you very much. So, to try to get back on schedule for the conference at large, we were told to try to finish in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience. We would love to hear from you. We'll take questions in rounds of 3. I'm not sure how many we'll have time for, but please try to limit your questions to under a minute, just so that as many people as possible can say something. Do you have any questions at the front? Yes, here at the back. And then one more. Should we take one more? Yes,
Gentleman
please.
there.
Okay, yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Alistair. My observation really is more to do with when you talk about the bodies. Can you speak up louder, brother?
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm into media. That's number one. Number two is to clarify topic like this really need to be amplified within the context of general conversation. Because any conversation that is not amplified die before it goes anywhere. And this is a topic that we've been talking about for quite a long time. So I really feel that we really need to improve on that media awareness, even especially from the mainstream. The other point as well is we talk about the bodies. Now, there has been a situation where statues have been brought down in the United Kingdom. More than 10 of them have been brought down. So the question goes back to the policy makers. Why is it hard for them not to recognize what the African people want regarding the bodies in the museum? That shouldn't be a matter of something. And then the final point as well is, as we're talking about this, I really would have liked to see more of African policy makers, meaning from the government institution. And then there's an onus of between the Africans and the Caribbean as well, that the issue of reparations seems to be harder or more recognized within the Caribbean nations rather than the African nation. We need to find out the reason why so that we can talk collectively, as we're saying, with one voice. And then as well, we have international people that are Africans and the Caribbeans. What are they doing to promote the issue of reparation? To many, the word reparation sounds like a hard word, and you don't want to be associated with it. I'm not an activist. I'm a corporate person, but I'm here to listen and to observe and to see how we can expand the conversation. Finally, I'm the founder of the first black television in Europe called Ben TV. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you
nice.
very much.
Well done, brother.
Brilliant. Thank you. We can take all three questions and then the panelists can answer. Yes, so here at the back, gentleman up there. Yeah, I'll try.
Oh, hello. Thank you very much, and thanks for those that interesting bit of information that you shared with regards to what the museums are doing and what they are not doing. The museums in this country have no interest whatsoever in returning anything. You know, they keep all the artifacts in a box or whatever. I, for one, have been to the Science Museum, and it was a terrible experience at the British Science Museum, which is just down the road there. And by the way, before we go any further, may I add, you spoke about Bernie Grant, great man, we miss him a great deal. And for that matter, let's give a good notice to Sharon, who was actually in the audience. Remember, Sharon Grant, Bernie's wife. Thank you, Sharon. The Science Museum is an awful place. To say there's prejudice there would be an understatement. They've got no intention whatsoever of showing any respect at all to African peoples, past or present. Secondly, there are 3 MPs here sitting at that table, not now, previously sitting at the table, 3 MPs. Get them on board. The active MPs, you know, they can lend their voices to the House of Parliament. Get them on board. So, the other thing is about to ask members of the public to talk to these people. They're not going to talk to us. They did it in the past, and I see no reason why they would do now. We have to get these MPs who are here today, get them on board. They can mention something in the House of Parliament. I know. And they can be, we can be assured that this can be mentioned. By the way, one of those MPs is also a journalist. There are 3 of them, so let's get them on board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that's brilliant. And
who's
the last question? Yes, here at the front. And it would be great just for time if you could ask one question.
It's a request rather than a question. I'm particularly interested in Dr. Sithole and Dr. Mhishi, I think. It's specifically about the heroes of the first Chimurenga in Zimbabwe. My name is Sukuru Rich Pantling Ngumalo. I've been visiting Zimbabwe regularly for the last 16 years, working with traditional healers, Sikiros, Mondoros, Sangomas there. So I understand fully the importance and significance to so many Zimbabweans about recovering the remains, particularly of Mbuya Nahanda, whose last words were, "My bones will rise again," in the 1890s when she was hanged by the people working for Cecil Rhodes and the British colonialists. I'm also curator now of an exhibition in Oxford University, which is open every day at the moment in the University Church, free to the public, celebrating the resilience of the Zimbabwean, indigenous Zimbabwean peoples since the 1890s, since the first Chimurenga. And I would like to invite anybody here, particularly anyone from the media, to work with me to see if we can hold some sort of protest demonstration vigil there that brings this issue to the attention of the general public in the UK. We got a bit of global publicity when we were in Zimbabwe earlier this year, organizing a competition in Chitungwiza Arts Centre for sculptors there, and we brought the works of the Zimbabwean sculptors to Oxford to bring their voice into the debate directly as a response to the Oxford Roads Must Fall and Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry, Elsie. Oh, okay. For a question. Okay, brilliant. Can we just answer the three questions, and then we'll see if we have time for additional ones. The first question, just to summarize it, was essentially why is it hard for policymakers to recognize the need for reparations, and how can we as advocates and practitioners amplify the point, or essentially why we need to return ancestral remains. Does anyone either here in the panel or online want to respond to that? How do we amplify this point?
I was going to jump in and then, yeah. I was going to jump in quickly just to... No, we won't. Promise you. You look too good to forget you. All right, so to the gentleman from Ben TV. So there's a particular dilemma with the Caribbean and the African story, which I can't get into. There's a lovely gentleman over there that can give you a nice talk in the air after. He's doing a lot of work in Birmingham. But initially, what we have is a situation where the reparations movement was grown out of Rastafari. And so what you have, I'm talking about in the context of Jamaica, yeah? And so in terms of Rastafari having a space over here, it becomes conflicted and funny, because there was a space for Rastafari, but then it became submerged due to a lot of things that I can't get into right now because we've got a short space of time. But the end of is that what we have is a dilemma in terms of identity crisis. And so because of that identity crisis being further funneled by lack of education, by museums also giving a narrative that excludes more advised, experienced voices in the space, because of various things, what we have is the reparation movement being minimized to a working class movement that does not get a space and an opportunity and a platform because they are working class, yeah? And so it's a lot of things to answer that question. It's a very large question that you asked, but I'm just trying to give you a hint of all of the backdrops towards what's going on. You've got you've got things happening, what they call the Caribbean quarrel, happening over in the Caribbean, then migrating over here, but in parcels where it's not able to express itself because it's being submerged. Yeah, that's why you had the riots during the 70s and all of those things. But the point is, what is happening now and what we're being called to do is to platform these issues in a way where it's funneled through an aspect. Each aspect needs an opportunity to have its own platform. This particular platform of ancestral remains will bring back the humanitarian aspects in regards to our traditions of burial, in regards to our traditions as being seen as human, because this is the greatest issue. The fact that we're not being seen as human as an African people, that is why they're able to continue with these practices and it being allowed. Yeah? So I'm hoping I helped out a little bit there.
Thank you very much, Connie. Thank you. And then there was the point about museums not being interested in returning remains, as well as how to get MPs on board.
Yeah, so I can answer that maybe. Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You know, we heard a moment ago from Scotland about how over 35 years, a colleague was saying, you know, there are really a handful of returns. I mean, we need to be very careful about these narratives being upbeat, which is often the you know, framing, when the risk is this is just a distraction. This is just, you know, non-performative, if I can use that term, from Sarah Ahmed, where she talks about non-performativity as something where a whole load of action and work and talk happens in order to change nothing. And actually, yeah, frankly, the same goes for artistic interventions as well. The risk is always there that this is art wash, that this is just a distraction from actually what people wanted is the removal of a statue of Cecil Rhodes. Instead, there's a nice exhibition about some sculptors from, you know, who are going to give a different sort of perspective on the history of Zimbabwe. If we're not careful, that becomes simply an attempt from the institutions to change the story and to distract and so on. So that's why this is, at this point, it just isn't working where we are in the museums and where we are with our institutions over heritage. So yeah, you know, this is absolutely why we need change of some kind. I think some sort of alteration for regulation has to happen, but who is guiding that? Who's making that? I mean, it needs to be the people in this room. It needs to be the, you know, the people online. It needs to be not the same old, you know, institutions and individuals who've been involved in the past, because it's failed so far.
I just wanted to add to Mr. Hicks, the reason why it's failed, everyone, you need to understand the importance of archives here. An archive follows a catalogue. It follows an opportunity to follow a thread. There is no thread. And that's part of the problem. There are a lot of these bodies and there's no cataloging of them. So when countries like when Rudo, Dr. Rudo comes and they speak on behalf of the Zimbabweans, they speak on behalf of the Herero people, they speak on behalf of, what we have is an issue where there's no thread. So then it's hard for them to argue, because then what the museums come back with is, well, we don't have that, we don't know of, yeah? And so, because of this distortion within the archives, which was purposely done, I think, this is just my theory, you know, the anonymity of these parts, we have to find another way, another strategy, which is why I'm trying to take it back to the local approach, where we come together as a community and we start to strategize with our people's assemblies and our supplementary learning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are over time. I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to wrap up. Our brilliant speakers will be here, so please feel free to ask them questions. I just want to thank everyone so much for attending. Before we leave, I just want to remind you to please sign up to get involved in the advocacy effort, either via the form, and there's also a QR code on the form, as someone said, and there will be protests, workshops, so please do get engaged. We want your experiences, your skills, your questions, and your answers. And then there are also some summary reports from the African Ancestral Remains Project, so please feel free to grab one if there's any left. Keep it for yourself, or perhaps give it to someone who's not yet convinced of what we're trying to do here. And again, thanking everyone, our brilliant speakers joining us both in person and online. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And I wish everyone a good Saturday, a good reparations conference, and please take care of yourself.